December 1098. The Syrian town of al-Numan had held out for 2 weeks. When its walls finally broke, they did not fall to brilliant strategy but to exhausted men climbing ladders in darkness while defenders poured boiling oil from above. Once the gates were breached, what followed was not battle, it was annihilation. Inside one cellar, a 31-year-old widow named Yasmin crouched with her daughters. Her husband had died on the walls days earlier. Above them, doors splintered. Screams moved street by street. Silence followed each forced entry. Each silence marked a family erased. The army that entered had marched for 3 years. They had crossed Europe and Anatolia, survived plague, starvation, and the brutal 8-month siege of Antioch. They believed suffering purified them. They believed God sanctioned their violence. They believed killing was worship. The massacre at killed thousands. Even Crusader chroniclers recorded the cannibalism that followed, a horror too widely witnessed to suppress. But they avoided detail about what happened to the living women. Arab historians did not. They described systematic searches of homes and cellars. Women were dragged into the streets. Young women were separated from crowds. Age determined fate. Youth meant value. Old age meant death. Children complicated the process. Some were killed to simplify it. This was not frenzy. It was procedure. The pattern had already formed at Antioch in June 1098. After 8 months of starvation, Crusaders stormed the city when a gate was opened from within. Latin chronicles like the Gesta Francorum celebrated divine victory and quickly passed over the hours of slaughter that followed. Arab chroniclers lingered there. They described women selected amid killing, claimed as spoils alongside gold, fabric, and horses. Distribution followed hierarchy. Nobles first, common soldiers last. Women were catalogued as property and vanished from Western narratives immediately after. 7 months after the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. On July 15, 1099, the city fell. The killing lasted 2 days. Crusader chaplains described soldiers wading in blood inside the Temple Mount complex, framing it as divine justice. Arab historians recorded organized sweeps through neighborhoods, civilians herded toward execution, and young women pulled from crowds before slaughter began. To be selected meant survival, but survival as property. Women taken at Jerusalem entered the same system as those from Antioch and They were divided, traded, absorbed into camps, and their names disappeared. What began as the violence of siege hardened into routine. What seemed like chaos from inside a burning house was, from the army's perspective, structured distribution. The Crusaders did not invent the practice of enslaving captives. Medieval warfare across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Islamic world normalized enslavement after conquest. What distinguished the early Crusades was scale and religious framing. Violence was not merely permitted, it was sanctified. The sermons that launched the First Crusade traced back to Pope Urban II, whose call at Clermont in 1095 promised remission of sins to those who marched east. The promise transformed warfare into pilgrimage. Killing became penance. Conquest became purification. When that theology collided with siege warfare, the civilian population inside the walls paid the price. After Jerusalem fell, the Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom and other states along the Levanten coast. Governance required law. Over decades, jurists compiled what became known as the Assizes of Jerusalem. Within this legal structure, captured Muslims were defined as property. They could be bought, sold, inherited, gifted. Courts adjudicated disputes over ownership. Lords claimed shares of captives just as they claimed shares of land. The language of charters and contracts placed human beings within categories of transferable wealth. The transformation from person to asset was not metaphorical, it was written into statute. A knight who claimed a woman during a siege was not violating law, he was operating within it. The system required markets. Coastal cities such as Acre became commercial centers linking Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Merchant fleets from Venice and Genoa docked in harbors where spices, sugar, textiles, and enslaved people were traded side by side. Surviving notarial registers list sales of captives with clinical precision. Age estimated, origin noted, price recorded. A woman might pass from soldier to merchant to ship captain within days. Her journey from a cellar in Syria could end in Sicily, southern France, or the Iberian Peninsula. Mediterranean commerce functioned on paperwork, and the paperwork survives. It reduces a life to a line item. Arab chroniclers writing in Damascus, Cairo, and Mosul documented these patterns with grief and fury. They described caravans of captives driven from ruined towns, families separated, daughters carried away. Yet Muslim armies also captured Frankish civilians. When Zengi took Edessa in 1144, Frankish settlers were enslaved. After the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem. Contemporary accounts note his comparatively restrained conduct, allowing ransoms and releasing some captives, but thousands still entered captivity. Later, the Mamluk ruler Baybars crushed remaining Crusader strongholds. When Antioch fell in 1268, Latin sources described massacre and enslavement in terms mirroring earlier Arab accounts of 1099. The symmetry complicates narratives of singular barbarity. Siege warfare across the medieval world produced systems in which women became spoils. Religion intensified justification, but the mechanism of captivity transcended faith. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade made that unmistakable. Diverted from its original objective, the Crusader army sacked Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity. The Byzantine historian Niktas Choniates recorded looted churches, desecrated altars, and Christian women assaulted by Christian soldiers. The pattern held. Once a city fell, women were absorbed into the economy of conquest. Whether Muslim in Jerusalem or Orthodox in Constantinople, they were categorized by utility. Over time, repetition dulled commentary. Early chroniclers sometimes registered shock. Later writers treated enslavement as background noise. Latin narratives focused on kings and campaigns, miracles and relics. Arab histories emphasized resistance and loss. Neither centered the daily existence of captive women. They appeared as objects acted upon, rarely as voices. The archival fragments that survive, petitions in Islamic courts, seeking recognition of marriages disrupted by capture, poetry lamenting daughters taken across the sea, marginal notes by scribes who recorded testimonies not included in formal chronicles, offer glimpses of interior lives. They suggest grief layered upon displacement, faith practiced in secrecy, identities negotiated within foreign households. Some captives assimilated over generations. Children born into servitude grew up speaking the language of their captors. Conversion, voluntary or coerced, blurred lines of belonging. Others were ransomed back to their communities, carrying trauma that sources only hint at. The social fabric of both Christian and Muslim societies absorbed these movements of people, rarely acknowledging the violence that propelled them. In European memory, the Crusades became epics of chivalry. Figures like Richard the Lionheart entered legend, cast against Saladin in narratives of noble rivalry. Castles and fortifications became tourist sites. The markets where women were sold left fewer visible ruins. In many educational traditions, the focus remained on diplomacy, battlefield tactics, and theological debate. The suffering of civilians, especially women, lingered at the margins. The imbalance was reinforced by language barriers. For centuries, Western historians relied primarily on Latin texts. Arabic chronicles remained untranslated or underused. When scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries began integrating both traditions, the composite picture grew darker and more complex. Military triumphs described in one corpus appeared as catastrophes in another. The gap was not fabricated, it was inherited. Each generation reproduced the sources it read most easily. The result was a narrative architecture sturdy enough to endure centuries but porous enough that alternative voices, once translated, could reshape it. Modern scholarship increasingly examines social history, daily life in Crusader states, intermarriage economic networks, the lived experiences of noncombatants. It situates crusading violence within broader medieval practices of enslavement stretching from Iberia to Central Asia. It recognizes that while theology mattered, so did hunger, debt, ambition, and profit. Yet public imagination often lags behind academic revision. The image of armored knights riding under the cross remains potent. Less visible are the administrative routines that followed victory, the appraisals, the contracts, the taxation of slave sales, the inheritance disputes over human beings. Behind each surviving document lies an absence. The woman recorded as aged about 20, of Syrian origin, had a childhood, a dialect, memories of seasons before siege. The Frankish girl taken in Edessa had parents who expected her return. The Byzantine nun dragged from her convent in 1204 had taken vows believing sanctuary would protect her. Their names surface rarely, if at all. What remains are structures, armies, laws, markets, chronicles. The Crusades reshaped borders and trade routes. They also generated cycles of captivity that bound generations of women to households not of their choosing. The silence that followed was not total. Arabic poetry, court records, and scattered European references preserve shards of testimony. But it was substantial enough that, for centuries, the dominant story foregrounded banners and battles. The truth is not that one civilization monopolized cruelty. The truth is that siege warfare, sacralized by religion and sustained by commerce, converted civilians into commodities on all sides. A Muslim woman taken in 1099 and a Frankish woman taken in 1144 inhabited parallel fates shaped by systems larger than themselves. The Crusades were campaigns of faith and power, but they were also engines of displacement. In cellars like Yasmin's, history narrowed to a moment. Boots overhead, a hatch forced open, a glance that determined whether one would live or die, and if living, in what condition. 9 centuries later, the archives still contain contracts, chronicles, and poems. They testify that beneath the clash of swords lay quieter transactions, evaluations, exchanges, silences. The record was never empty. It was selective. To read it fully requires placing the women of Antioch, Myra, Jerusalem, Edessa, Constantinople, an acre not at the edge of the page but within its center, where the consequences of conquest were lived rather than proclaimed.